Hey everyone, thank you for joining episode 19 of The Green Life. Today's episode is a little different. We'll be discussing food politics. Now, food politics is not something that most of us really talk about or even know about, but we really should. It's an important topic because it's the relationship between our governments and corporations that give life to policies that either benefit us, the people, the citizens, the consumers, or corporations. As it stands, most countries have policies that benefit corporations a lot more than people. So how do we find out about this? How do we learn? How do we find the solution? Nobody can speak about food politics better than Professor Marion Nestle. Professor Nestle has been teaching food politics and nutrition at NYU for over 30 years, and she's also a visiting professor at Cornell University for nutritional science. She earned a Ph.D. in molecular biology and M.P.H. in public health nutrition from University of California, Berkeley, and her CV is extensive. She's also a 12 times published author with the latest book called Slow Cooked that is out this year. So there is so much to say about Dr. Nestle. Her CV is so long that we will be having an episode just to talk about that. So I'm not going to go through that, but all the information is on the show notes, and you can really have a good read on her website, foodpolitics.com. So without further ado, let's dive into this interesting, although not so happy subject, food politics. Welcome, Dr. Nestle. Thank you so much for joining because it's really amazing to have you here. A lot of people don't understand the correlation between the choices that we make and the political the environment around food. You know, people think it's really straightforward, but actually it really isn't all the time. And you've written extensively about this. So, well, before we go into the actual meat of, no pun intended for a vegan, but of the conversation, how did you get into this topic? Why did you choose food politics as your main, focus?
Oh, I would say it chose me. Yeah, I couldn't have avoided. I mean, I have certain points at which I've always been interested in food and I've always been interested in politics. But they really came together for me at a meeting that I went to in the early 1990s at the National Cancer Institute in Washington, D.C., where there was a conference on behavioral causes of cancer. And they were talking about cigarettes and diet. And I knew that smoking caused lung cancer. I was well aware of that. But I had never heard the anti-smoking physicians, scientists, that whole community of advocates for less smoking. I'd never heard them talk before. And I watched their talks where they showed pictures, one after another of cigarette marketing to adults, and then even more shocking, cigarette marketing to children. And I knew that cigarette companies marketed, and I knew that cigarette companies marketed to children, but I'd never paid any attention to it before. And somehow having all those pictures of Joe Camel and cigarette advertising around schools and in places where young children congregated, music venues, whatever, somehow seeing them one after another brought the point home. And I walked out of that meeting saying, or thinking that we nutritionists should be doing this for Coca-Cola. We should be paying attention to the way the makers of junk food market their products to children and adults. And so I started paying attention, and have been paying attention to it ever since.
My goodness. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I didn't really realize, I'll be honest, that cigarettes were marketed to children. I know that they were marketed to pregnant ladies. I know doctors were saying they're completely safe for pregnancy, and obviously to the general population, but I never actually thought that they would market to children. And now what we know, wow.
Yeah, the marketing was very subtle. Or maybe wasn't so subtle. I mean, there was something called the Joe Camel character, which was something for Camel cigarettes. And it was somebody who looked very cool, and it was absolutely designed to appeal to young teenage boys. The boys 12, 13, 14. Get them hooked on cigarettes early and they'll be smokers for life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that is true for the most part, actually. Although I'm happy to see that a lot of people are becoming much more aware of this and trying to stop if they are smoking. Although I've noticed the difference. So living in the UK, I've noticed how London is much more kind of conscious about the smoking. And I saw less and less people actually having cigarettes. But now we moved to Europe. We are in Portugal. And here, cigarettes are still a very big thing, like they are in Spain, like they are in Italy. And so it's interesting to see the differences between countries, right? The way they approach cigarettes and how they are intertwined into the social behavior and customs.
Well, cigarette companies pay a lot of taxes. And it puts governments in a very bad position. They cut off the money if but it's about money. The whole thing is about money, and it's not about any kind of ethical or moral or health or any values. It's about money.
Yeah, and this is the same for food, obviously.
It is the same for food.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how, when did it go pear-shaped? Because I would assume everybody thinks that governments have their citizens' best interest at heart, right? So you would want to we have agencies like FDA, USDA, and you think that they really care to make sure that the citizens are healthy, because ultimately it does cost money to be sick at government level as well. Where did it go from, sure, companies will always be companies and do whatever they want to do to make money, and they advertise the way they do, to having a lot more a relaxed kind of leeway into how they advertise and how much they advertise and what they can advertise from government level? Because you would assume the government would say, hey, you really can't do this, so you have to put a stop, regulate it a little bit better. Did it change at some point, or was it always this way?
Yeah, I mean, it changed in 1980 is the year that is typically used as the inflection point. A lot of things happened in 1980 in the United States. President Reagan was elected with a neoliberal pro-corporate agenda, deregulatory agenda. And a lot of things changed then. The investment system changed so that stockholders were demanding higher immediate returns on investment. Corporations took over and we have a government that's captured by corporations. Lobbyists became more plentiful and we're spending more money. We now have laws that, any corporation can give as much money as they want in an election campaign. The system is very, very corrupt and has become more corrupt. And so governments are not particularly powerful to do anything to curb corporate influence, even if that influence is against public health. And of course, we're in a country that doesn't have a healthcare system. Everything is privatized, and it makes the whole situation extremely difficult. It's very difficult for advocates to oppose corporate money because the corporations have so much of it and they pay people to lobby for them. It's hard for advocates to get paid for advocacy. And we have to remember, it took 50 years for anti-smoking advocates to get public policy to the point where it discouraged public smoking, for example. It took 50 years. And the cigarette companies did everything they could during that 50-year period to deflect attention from cigarettes, to make sure that everybody thought that the research was too complicated to make any decision about it, that it didn't show anything. We're seeing the same kinds of actions by food companies now. And I like to explain this as food companies are not social service agencies and they're not public health agencies. They're businesses with stockholders who demand high immediate returns on investment and don't want the companies to be doing anything that's going to reduce the size of their returns. So that's what we're up against. And for an individual to try to fight that system, to eat healthfully and not gain weight is very, very difficult.
So what is the solution then if we can rely on the government to kind of safeguard what's available to us? And, in a way, we shouldn't have a nanny state. We should be making decisions for ourselves. But if we can't rely on that, the clarity of the science, the clarity of the information, what can people do to make sure that they kind of preserving the health that they have? Because ultimately our bodies are the most precious things we have, right? When it comes to our property.
I mean, that's not an easy question to answer. I think education is a big part of it. And since there's no public education around this, you have to educate yourself. Mm-hmm. I think you have to be skeptical. A couple of things have happened in the last few years that I think make the situation a little bit easier. And one of them is the definition of ultra-processed foods, a very important advance in nutrition science that comes from Brazil. A professor at the University of Sao Paulo, Carlos Monteiro, in 2009, developed a classification system for processing of foods in which there was one classification that he named ultra processed, which is a fancy name for junk foods. It's what we used to call junk foods, except it's junk foods with a particular definition. And that is, this is a food product that's industrially produced and cannot be made in home kitchens. You can't buy the ingredients at a supermarket, take them home, and formulate whatever this food product is. And the most obvious examples are soft drinks, heavily sugared soft drinks, potato chips or corn chips of various kinds, fast food, which has lots of ingredients in it that are really not available to home cooks. And there's now an astonishing amount of research linking this category of foods to poor health, to overweight, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, excess mortality, and severe outcome from COVID-19. And we even have a really well-controlled clinical trial that shows that people who are fed diets based on ultra-processed foods take in 500 calories more a day without realizing it. They don't even know they're eating more. And yet they're taking in 500 calories more a day. They're gaining a pound a week. And they don't even know that that's happening. And they can't tell the difference between that diet and an equally palatable diet formulated pretty much the same way, but not processed in the same way. Yeah. So there's something about these highly processed foods that makes people want to eat more of them. It's really simple. They're designed that way. They're designed for the purpose of selling because these are among the most profitable products in the supermarket. So I think this has made life much easier for people in nutrition because all you have to do is say, stop eating ultra-processed foods or don't eat so much of them. Just, don't eat so much of them. If you're going to eat ultra-processed foods, be careful of how much you're eating. Keep the quantity small. And that simplifies things enormously. All you have to do is get people to understand what an ultra-processed food is, which isn't all that hard. And if you're lucky and you live in a country with a warning label on it, it makes it much easier. And then you advise people to just avoid those foods. Read ingredient lists. If you can't recognize the ingredients, it's ultra-processed.
Yeah, totally. But you'll be surprised how many people don't really recognize that at all. They really don't. They never read the ingredients list,
Well, they're hard to read. And
Yeah.
and I see packages in the United States where they're printed on dark blue on a slightly lighter blue. You can't even distinguish them.
Yeah.
Or they're printed in ways that where you just can't read them in tiny, tiny print. You've got to have your glasses on. You need a magnifying glass to see them. They don't want you to see them.
Yeah, and that's tricky. And this is where, food policies would be, the regulation would be a little bit more helpful if they actually dictated that, hey, you know what, you want to make what you want to make, but at least allow people to understand what they're eating, make sure they can read the labels.
Well, that's why the warning labels that are becoming increasingly common in Latin American countries are so important, because even people who are illiterate and can't read, even children who haven't learned how to read yet, can see the symbols on the package and say, we shouldn't be buying this.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening in Chile and Peru and Brazil and other countries in Latin America. I think it's a very good thing.
That's a very good thing. How can you compare that to, say, the traffic light system that they put on packaging in the UK, for example?
Well, I like the warning labels better because they're clearer. The traffic light symbols in Great Britain, I think there are 4 or 5 categories. And so when you look at a package, it's got red, yellow, and green, and you don't, how are you supposed to balance that? Suppose it has 2 reds because it's high in salt and sugar, and 2 greens because it's got something good in it. How are you supposed to figure that out? That's complicated. And I feel the same way about Nutri-Score, which is used in several European countries, where there's a letter and colors, and you have to know what those letters and colors mean in order to understand what it is that, it gives an overall score, A through E, but you have to know that A is really good and E is really bad. That's too much to know. I think the warning labels are much simpler and make much more sense, and they've been shown to be more effective. Yeah. Which is why the food industry imposes them so much.
Yeah, of course. And can I just ask, if it's happening in South America, why do you think that their government allows it and our governments seem not to really take that on board?
Well, I asked that question of Carlos Montero at one point, because Brazil has dietary guidelines that are the best dietary guidelines in the world. They're really, really good. And they're very straightforward about what you should and shouldn't eat. And they take in family values and cultural values and all kinds of other things. They're very good. And I asked him how on earth he got those things through. And it was a combination of circumstances where they had a lot of academic support for those dietary guidelines at a time when there was a government that was interested in doing something to prevent chronic disease in the population. So it was a combination of things that occurred at the same time that allowed it to get through, but a lot of it had to do with the extraordinary amount of research, the effort that the academics who were involved in it put into it to make sure that they had their research very, very well set out. And in the countries in Latin America where there are these kinds of things, there's a very strong public health community behind them. In other countries, it's not working. We certainly can't have anything like that in the United States. That would be out of the question, I think.
Although it's happening more in communities, I guess. A lot of people are starting to think, let me buy a local level, let me support the farmers, the CS, the community farmers are much more available in certain places. So that's probably starting, but not a governmental level, which is in a way is good. I think in a way it's good to have smaller communities responsible for their choices, so that you can also control what comes in and discuss it openly with the people that are involved, versus having layers and layers of bureaucracy at a level that you will probably never reach, because how can you, get hold of the president of the FDA, for example? Like, it's really impossible. So maybe that's an opportunity more than a problem, if we want to look at it that way.
Yeah, I'm greatly in favor of local control and local production. I mean, it's wonderful to know farmers in the area. It's wonderful to support farmers in the area. And the local communities are a way in which individuals could get involved that wouldn't be possible at either the regional or state or national level, at least in the United States. So I'm greatly in favor of local efforts of any kind, and there's a lot that cities and communities can do to promote healthier diets and healthier lifestyles, and make things better for everybody in the community. That's a good thing.
Yeah. How have you seen the policies change for farmers in the past, say, 20 years, where, I see that there are some restrictions almost, and that in some states it's really difficult to have, your own home growing food and collecting rainwater. And there are policies that are making it difficult for people to be a little bit independent. Do you think these policies are there because of the, influence of corporations that want to control certain things? Why do you think there is such a gap between, okay, we have those corporations that want to sell, that's fine, but we also should give people the freedom to grow their own food? Why is such a problem to do that in some places?
Well, I think this is a question of political power and who has the power. As I said, corporations have one goal, and that's to sell more food of whatever food they're making. Their goal is very simple. Individuals and families have much more complicated goals and a lot more going on, and they're not being paid to argue or to advocate or to do any kind of lobbying for a particular issue. So unless there's somebody locally who is organizing people to become a pressure group to try to get favorable laws passed, it's just not going to happen. Because the people who have a vested interest in keeping the system the way it is are paying people to do that advocacy work for them. And I see that as the biggest problem that we have in local politics in the United States. We have thousands and thousands of advocacy groups on food issues. They are uncountable. There are so many of them. You can go to any city or town in America and find 10 advocacy groups for one or another food issue, but they're not organized. They're not coordinated. They're not in coalitions. They're not set up in a way to have real political power. And nobody is paying them to do this work. Yeah. It's just an enormous problem, and I don't see an easy solution to it. I talk a lot about the need for coalition building. If food advocates are going to have real power, they have to be associated with lots and lots of other organizations. And the only ones that seem to be able to do that are the people who are working on food insecurity, hunger and malnutrition among poor people in poor communities. There are a lot of groups working on that, and they work together. But for anybody working on anything more controversial, and trying to prevent weight gain and chronic disease is extremely controversial because it requires people to eat less or to change the kinds of foods they're eating. And that becomes very controversial right away.
Yeah. Can I ask you a controversial question?
Of course.
Have you looked at any correlation between GMOs and the decline on public health?
No, okay. Not GMOs in particular. There's very little evidence that GMOs have an effect on health, except for the herbicides that are used with them. But in the United States, we hardly have any genetically modified crops that people are eating as food. Most of the genetically modified crops are being fed to animals or being used to produce ethanol as fuel for cars. There are only a few food products that are on the market if you go into a supermarket in the United States, you're not going to find any of genetically modified foods that I'm aware of, except for an occasional papaya from Hawaii or a fancy pink pineapple from Costa Rica that costs really a lot. There's supposed to be some squash and potatoes, but nobody thinks they're on the market. Supermarkets don't want to sell them. They're supposed to be labeled, and nobody wants to get into the whole issue. So the GMO foods are corn, soybeans, cotton, sugar beets that you don't really eat as food. You eat them as ingredients in processed foods.
So they still relate to the processed food issue.
So it goes right back to processed foods, and the overt health effects are being seen, at least allegedly, among people who work a lot with Roundup and other chemicals that are used with genetically modified foods. And there the courts are largely ruling in favor of people who claim that the herbicides have caused them to become ill and to have various kinds of blood cancers. And I can't sort all of that out. I think those chemicals are not good. They certainly kill things in soil that ought to be in soil, and they're not very good for insects. The herbicides and the insecticides and all of the things that they're using are killing non-target insects as well. So it encourages growth of crops in places that are not really favorable to growing crops. So there are lots of reasons for not liking GMOs, but the immediate health effects from eating the products themselves, I'm just not seeing any.
Okay. Yeah. And it's very hard. I've actually tried to see also some research, and it's very hard to find any long-term study as well. They've done some on mice, but again, very short term. So it's a curious, it's one of those questions that I feel like we haven't gotten a full answer on. It's just, we don't really see it per se, but then we also wonder, right? And there are so many variables, exactly as you said. What if it's the products that they use with GMOs that are the problem? Or could it be the fact that because GMOs are used in places where, to grow crops in places that they shouldn't be growing, how does that affect the soil? Because if our soil is not healthy, we are not going to be healthy because our food is going to be depleted, right?
Yeah, well, there's no question that they're not good for soil because the chemicals that are used for them kill things in soil that shouldn't be killed. And I think this is about corporate control of the food supply. And it's just exactly the opposite of the kind of agriculture that you want. What you really want is what's now called regenerative agriculture, which is an agricultural system that puts back into soil everything that's taken out of it. And we now know that regenerative agriculture is not only good for soil, but it's good for climate change. It sequesters carbon, it's sustainable, and it's almost as productive as industrial agriculture, but productivity is not the big issue. Sustainability is the big issue.
And so you actually segue into another topic that I think is very important, with companies like Monsanto, like Bayer's, and so many more coming together to sort of control the food supply, right? Mm. What is the stance of the government when it comes to this? Because at what point does it become illegal almost to authorize these companies to control the seeds, to control the food supply, and not allow people to be independent in growing their own food, or to penalize independent growers, the farmers that perhaps, they won't use the GMO seeds, so they will only want to use heirloom and organic, and obviously the production needs to be limited to a smaller amount of people, so more people should get into that kind of agriculture, but there's just no financial support from the government to do that. When do you think it would be, time to call out the government and say enough is enough? And I think at this point,
I think people are trying to do that, but we have a government that's captured by corporations. There was a very, very good analysis of this published in the Lancet in the beginning of 2019, where there were two enormous papers published there that talked about what you should be eating for a healthy food system and a healthy population. And the second of those papers talked about the need for sort of analyze the political system, that we have political systems now in which we have very weak governments from the standpoint of public policy for public health. We have very strong food corporations and very weak civil society. And so there's your agenda. Your choice is to strengthen government, weaken the food industry, or strengthen the civil society, or do all three. And so the political challenge now is to figure out how to do that. And the second of those papers came out with an agenda for how to put controls on the food industry. But if there's nobody to do that, and if there isn't a lot of public demand for it, it's just not going to happen. I see that as the current political challenge.
Yeah,
is trying to turn that situation around.
Yeah. So you've been. I'd like to now go a little bit into your academia, because you are a professor in NYU of food politics. So when you talk to your students, what is their reaction if they never heard about this before, generally?
Oh, our students have heard about it. I teach in a department that has programs in food studies, and I teach in food studies, and the students come into food studies because they're interested in using food as a way to advocate for healthier people and a healthier planet. They're way ahead of me politically. They're there to learn and to get the tools I teach courses in food advocacy, how to advocate, and they're there to get those kinds of tools so they can go try to create the kind of food system that they think we ought to have.
Oh, that's amazing.
So, yeah, they're very exciting to teach.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, and I guess the course is super fun to hear what ideas they come up with. And if we had anybody in the audience that wanted to learn, a couple of tricks, like they're very, because I have a lot of people that are engaged into this kind of movement, which is great. But if there were three skills that they really should get down when it comes to advocacy and creating a difference, what do you think those would be, in your opinion?
Oh, well, there are rules about advocacy. There are books that you can read about how to do it, and they all say exactly the same thing. The first is that you have to have a very clearly defined goal. You have to know exactly what it is that you're advocating for, what you want the end result to be. And then you have to identify who or what is the entity that is able to make the change that you want to make. And that's the person or the entity that you're going to be lobbying and trying to get on your side and trying to get moving on something. So that's the first thing, is to have very clear goals and targets. And the second is to organize allies. You want to have the largest possible number of people supporting you in this work and working with you to convince the entity that can make the change to make the change. And that's the critical one, because I went to public health school, and in public health school, they teach us to work with communities to define what they want and need and to help them get what they want and need. But in practice, almost nobody asks community people what they want. They're not working with communities. They're telling communities what to do. There's a big difference. So I would say that the third thing is, in collecting allies, you have to work with the people who are going to be benefiting from whatever the intervention is, to make sure that the intervention is one that they want and support.
Yeah.
It's a slow process, so that, everybody thinks that people should eat more fruits and vegetables. And people who do that think that if they just assume that if people had more access to fruits and vegetables, they would buy them. But that turns out not to be true. And if you go into communities and ask people in communities what they want, it might be something very different. And so it's important to find out from the people who you're trying to reach what it is that they want and how they want to be dealt with. So it's, but as I say, there are books about how to do this. And so when advocacy is done by the book, it has a really good chance of working. And the example that I always give is the soda tax initiative that was passed in Berkeley, California some years ago, where there was real community organizing that went on there. The people who were in favor of that initiative did door-to-door canvassing. They knocked on the doors of everybody in every community in Berkeley, rich and poor. And they talked to people. Does anybody in your family have type 2 diabetes, or do you know anyone with type 2 diabetes? And what happened to those people? And do you know about how sugary drinks relate to type 2 diabetes? And, those kinds of discussions. And they did a lot of listening to people in the community. And when the final vote came, the final vote was 76% of the voters voted for the tax. That is incredible.
Yeah.
That's an incredibly high percentage. And they were able to get that percentage because of the community work that they had done. So I can't, that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
And
no,
I believe that. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of listening and of respecting of other people's opinions, and trying not to impose what you think on other people. So I don't know. When it's done right, it works.
Yeah, you're right. And you said before, one of the ways is to find allies. And I think that is also other people that are working towards the same goal, but in different kind of practices. So, for example, you mentioned some communities, they might not have vegetables and fruit now, but if you bring them in, that doesn't mean they're going to buy it. And that comes to the fact that, well, maybe they don't know how to use them. They don't know how to eat them, and they don't have the palate for it because they've been eating junk food for the longest time. Exactly. So here it comes the education part, where you have cooking classes and teaching them about health, and then getting them interested in exploring if they are, especially if they are concerned with their health or have diseases, which happens a lot in low-income communities, that they have type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular health issues. So you're right. It needs to be a real, common effort of many different sizes to build the puzzle, because it's complicated. It's very complicated. And that's one word you use a lot. And I love that, because it's true. It's not, it's complicated. It's a whole entire structure that has to be put together.
Yes. No. But I think it can be done. And that working towards a healthier population and a healthier planet, these are very good goals. They're really worth working for. Yeah. Something to get you up in the morning. You think, how can I make the world a better place? These are two ways to make the world a better place.
Oh, totally. So we don't want to be poopers about all the problems which we talked about, because they sound very overwhelming and unresolvable, but they are slowly. But what are there must be changes that you've seen happening that are so positive that you actually are like, okay, it's good. This is going on, and it's moving the right direction. So we talked about the fact that now cigarettes companies obviously can't just do whatever they want. That was a win. Do you see other changes that are positive because of the people? Obviously, as you just talked about Berkeley's, but at a bigger level, do you see things changing for the better in some ways?
Oh, I think lots of ways. I mean, in the United States, for example, there's much healthier food in supermarkets than there was 30 years ago, and it's much more available, and it's available everywhere in the country. So that's been a big change. The biggest one is the extent of interest in these questions, and that there are so many people now who recognize what the problems are and want to do something about them. There's a push towards more organic food production. There's a push towards more vegetarian diets. There's more and more people going into professions in which they can work on food issues. I think there's much greater recognition that food is important to health. And important for a lot. I have to laugh because it seems so obvious. But it hasn't always been seen that way. And I think there's also greater recognition of the role that industry plays in this. That industry is not our friend. Industry is a business. There's a lot of transactional stuff that goes on that's not so nice. And that really the purpose of industry is to get us to eat whatever they're doing. And putting most of the money in marketing behind the products that are most expensive, that are most profitable for them, and least expensive for us, but most profitable for them, and that are probably worse for our health. And there's more and more recognition of that. And of course, the companies are fighting back on it. And their fights are more visible. A lot of that came out during the COVID pandemic in ways that were very surprising to me. I think there was much, much greater recognition of the food industries, particularly the meat industries, rather callous way of dealing with the people that it employed, and its suppliers and everybody else except their corporate profit takers. It was, it was kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people.
Yeah, there is. A lot of people are worried about what happened through the pandemic in the meat industry. There was a lot of, as you said, they just cut people out. They stopped they stopped dispensing the products to supermarkets. Now, obviously, as a plant-based person, vegan, animal lover, I'm like, we should really just stop that. But I understand that it's again, it's complicated, and it's but one thing that a lot of people are wondering is this an agenda to have meat lab creating fake meats, or you hear this, right? What's your opinion on that? What is your take on this approach?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not a vegan myself. I don't eat a lot of meat, but I do eat some, and I try to pick it carefully. But I don't understand the push towards artificial meats. I don't see any reason why people need to eat meat if they don't want to. There are plenty of delicious foods that are vegetable-based or plant-based or one kind or another. So I kind of don't get why anybody would want artificial meat. One of my food rules is never eat anything artificial. So they're kind of off my dietary radar. I would not choose an artificial meat product. If I want a veggie burger, you can make fabulous veggie burgers out of vegetable pulp. You fry it up and put it on a bun. It's delicious. As far as I'm concerned, I don't see any reason for it, but I've had it explained to me any number of times. My favorite explanation was the woman who told me that she just loved the idea of artificial meat because now she could take her child to fast food restaurants.
Oh, boy.
I thought, oh, okay. All
missing
right.
the mark.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
But it has been explained to me, and people who are vegan have told me that they really miss the taste of meat. I think, really? I don't. Okay, whatever. But they really do. And these products that have been formulated out of various plant ingredients have been formulated brilliantly to mimic the taste of meat. I think I've tasted them. I think they're pretty good, substitutes. But as I said, they're not something I would choose. And they are ultra processed. That means you can't make them in your home kitchen. They have enormous numbers of ingredients that are not available in supermarkets. So they're kind of off my dietary radar, but they are of great interest to venture capitalists. There's a lot of money in them. Some people really like them. There's lots of effort going into demonstrating that they're healthier than beef, which shouldn't be too hard to do, and that they're better for the planet, which may be a little complicated to do. We're back to complicated again. So I don't know. I think the jury is still out on them.
Yeah, I must say I'm. It's tough for me to be. I'm vegan but plant-based, and for me, I really believe that sometimes when vegan make choices, and I'm not offending any vegans, I hope, but we can be a little bit egocentric, as in I gave up this for the animals, but I still want something that it's that bridge or that makes me taste the meat. And to me, it's there are so many levels to being plant-based vegan, as in I love the animals, but to me, our impact on the planet is also important. For example, if I'm sick and I'm taking medicine, these medicines are tested on animals. So I want to avoid taking drugs and really just be as healthy as I can, or taking drugs that then, I will pee into the toilet and that water goes into the sea. So, there is this ripple effect that I'm thinking about all the time. And also, I'm very much about being conscious about the food that we eat for our health, because it's really, really important to be understanding that a plant-based diet shouldn't just be about having processed foods and that are vegan, but then still jeopardizing our health and not being energetic and functional in the way that we can actually impact our society in a positive way. Because if you're sick, whether you're vegan or not. And that's something that is missing in the vegan community. There's a little bit of education that has to go into the vegan space as well. We are very disconnected in this journey with people that love animals and want to be vegan versus and people that want to be vegan, love animals, but also want to be healthy. There's such a disconnect. And it's a shame, right? We should be united. But I think you mentioned it before, in any activism, sometimes these groups don't talk to each other. They don't they don't do any coalition so that they can be strong together. And that's showing, in the impact that we all have. So I can understand that. But it's interesting how we look at this. And for me, even lab meat, as in not even the fake meat, but actually lab meat, they want to reproduce meat in a lab. So fake animal meat. That it's so beyond, a little bit creepy, really, but it's like, wow, Frankenstein kind of approach. It's crazy. But you're right, it is of interest to venture capitalists, and it's always the same people that are investing in this. For example, Tyson is a big company of animal products, but now they are very much invested into the other side. So one has to wonder, right? Why is this push, and is it really all about ecological issues? I'm not quite sure, because
it's about money.
It's about money. Because eventually, even growing crops like corn and soy, especially because they will use GMO for these things, going into these foods, that's not good for the planet. They're still destroying.
Yeah, and as I said, I think the jury is still out. I'm trying very hard to keep open-minded about these products. I'm really working hard on it because I understand that there are different points of view about it. As I said, they're off my radar because I try not to eat anything artificial.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, must be really interesting to write books where you're like, you have to try and give.
I like writing books.
You love writing, and you're very good at it. So
thank you.
You're welcome. Brilliant. Okay, so that's I just came up with this because there are so many topics coming up about the World Economic Forum and what they're trying to do, and there's a jury about everything right now, about what the agenda is, how it's going to impact us, even how technology is going to impact the way that our food is produced. And so it's very, in a way, it's scary, but I think it's a really good time right now to be, in a way, politically active, to try and change certain things. And I go back to the fact that perhaps we need to be more community-based and try to keep things local instead of relying on this massive global approach of everything. So going back to your students for a couple of last questions, what do you see them achieving that you're really proud of when they come to your class and then they leave with something that you're like, yeah, you got it?
Well, our students come in wanting to do something with it. So I'm not sure what my role in that is, except to just cheer them on. And many of the students in the food studies program go on to work with non-governmental organizations and groups that are working on food issues of one kind or another. There's certainly plenty of need. The big challenge that they have is finding a job that will pay them enough so that they can do the kind of work that they want, but they're finding it. So, they work with farm organizations that I can think of several who are doing that, or working with foundations that are giving grants for one kind of thing or another. So they're out there. And I hope that they will leave with the understanding that one person really can make a difference, and that if that one person is working with other people, they can make even a bigger difference.
And did anybody become an author after you?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Lots of our students write books, lots.
Yay, amazing.
Lots.
Oh, that's perfect. Easy.
Yeah, at one point we were keeping a list of the books written by graduates of our program, but it got very long.
That's amazing. Very well done. Yeah, because we need this kind of topic. I mean, you are one of the biggest that I know, and then Michael Pollan is another one that writes about it very beautifully. But it's I haven't seen many of the new, and I'm sure there are. It's just that I haven't seen them marketed in the way they probably should. And it's good to know that there is material up there because we need resources.
Well, I think I need to mention that one of my books has been translated into Portuguese.
Amazing. We're gonna have to,
and you should say something about that.
I shall, and I will share it with people. I don't speak Portuguese yet properly.
Oh, you don't? Oh, you're in Portugal.
I am in Portugal. We kind of came here from London. For regenerative agriculture, we bought a farm, and we're doing that.
Wonderful.
Yes, we killed a few plants in order to learn how to grow them, but it was something that I was really keen about. My husband and I left banking, and we just thought we need to have more meaning in our life, living around animals and growing our own food was one of them, and trying to impact the community positively. So we learned there are a lot of people here that are doing that. There are a lot of people from the UK, Ireland, that are moving here that do.
I have a colleague at NYU who's just bought a farm in Portugal.
Perfect. That's amazing.
You should all get to know each other.
Yes, I would love that. We all want to do something like that, and I see this as a movement. But I also know your book being translated in Portuguese is great, because I also know people that work in schools here that are alternative schools that are trying to teach their pupils to be more aware of everything that encompasses food politics, food choices, regenerative agriculture, and how to treat the planet. So this would be a great resource. I'm happy that it happened. Congratulations. It's a good achievement. So more and having your students writing books is great, because more resources are needed, because I feel like I learned about this a little bit later. It was a trigger for me to make changes, which I'm really, really grateful for. But I learned about it later. I heard, you spoke at IIN, where I studied health coaching. And this is how I heard and learned about you. And I was so inspired because I thought I knew that something was off, but I just didn't know what. So this has been really good, eye opener, and I'm really appreciative of that. So it's a journey that we're going towards, and I think it's going to be a very interesting one in the next few years. And you're continuing to teach at NYU, correct?
Somewhat. I didn't teach this year.
Okay.
I'm waiting for the pandemic to slow down a bit.
You had your course for a very long time, right?
Yes.
Yeah, amazing. And always at NYU?
Yes. I taught at NYU for 30 years.
Amazing. Well, Professor Nestle, thank you so much for
pleasure.
your time. And, it's amazing the work that you do. You wrote amazing books. And I think if you keep on sharing and raising their awareness, people will take notice. So thank you for doing what you do. And it was a pleasure speaking.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye. Thank you, Professor Nestle, and thank you everyone for staying on for this episode. I really hope that everyone got a lot out of it and that it was a good introduction to food politics. We could have gone down a few rabbit holes, but to be fair, I wanted to keep it really light 101 and something that is digestible for everybody. To start, however, learning more about food politics, you can purchase Professor Nestle's books. She has amazing material, very extensive work, and I've also attached a link at the bottom of the show notes where you can get more information about the current sustainability agenda and food supply, and really just dig a little deeper into the subject at your own time if you wish to. It's an interesting one, and it might take a little bit of time, but it's a very good way to connect dots, and I think it gives you a little bit of power to make better decisions. So I hope this is inspiring that way. So guys, if you like the episode, of course, like it, share it, review it, and I will see you next week.